raises, and also what I'll call at least the stunning silence for years, which has always bothered me on racial issues in Major League Baseball, except, you know, for a few programs here and there. So we'll talk about all of this. I'm not going to go through everyone's bios, the speakers, because that's always really boring. So I'll let them introduce themselves in any way that they want. I'll just tell you sort of what's going to be going on here. So everyone's going to be muted for now, except for the panelists. We're going to have sort of 3 rounds of questions that they're all going to answer. People can put questions in the chat room. I'm going to try and track them as best that I can. So keep them pretty concise. And if you want to stick around to have a more informal discussion afterwards, if there are people who want to do that, we'll stick around and unmute some people depending on how it goes. So, and you know, comments and all that, welcome in the chat room. Nothing too off color, although with this group, I'm not sure I can control that. And let's get started. So the first question that I want to ask, and I'm asking the panelists to keep their answers short to around 3 minutes because we've got 4 of them. So what the hell is going on? There were all sorts of things that went on today with contract negotiations. This seems to be going on forever. There could be implications for the game going forward for next year. It's obviously making a lot of people pretty pissed off. So, and whose fault is it? Because I think we have some opinions on that a little bit. So I'm going to call on Craig first to talk about this, since he's been tweeting and reporting on it on NBC all day.
Hi, I'm Craig. I write for NBC Sports, and I live on Twitter all day. And yes, I have done nothing for the past couple of months except follow the labor situation, which is the primary driver of the problem. Well, it's the effect of the primary driver, of course, which is, you know, the pandemic. And for a while, we thought we had something going on. We thought we had a pretty good way for baseball to come back. Baseball was going to be the first to come back. It was going to get its season. It was going to save us all from misery or something or other. I don't know. I didn't follow the talking points on that too closely. But what we did have is we had this agreement in March between the union and Major League Baseball about how we will play, how the players will be paid, and that everything would just be lovely, and we'd have the 4th of July be opening day, and God bless America and all that. 3 months later, we basically are in the exact same place that we were 3 months ago. Today, Rob Manfred said that we have an agreement that could, a framework that could lead to an agreement, which isn't very promising. And it's especially not promising when you realize that the framework is basically Major League Baseball simply admitting that it has to abide by the agreement they had back in March. The fight, as you've probably read somewhere, is over salary. Will the players be paid on a pro rata basis per game, or will they have to take some additional discount? The owners agreed, Major League Baseball agreed back in March that they will be paid pro rata, and have done nothing since except try to negotiate the players down off of that position. The players, for the first time in about 15, 20 years, have actually held some solidarity together. And haven't caved to ownership demands. And so that's why we're here. Rob Manfred and the owners can't remember institutionally what it means to fight a union with solidarity, and the players, for once, have it. Where I think we're going is we are going to probably get a season of about 60 to 65 games. We'll all forget how the salary thing works, you know, as soon as the games start, but the players will be paid on a pro rata basis. It won't be a season of anything approaching, I think, competitive integrity as we all know it, but we'll probably have a fun little tournament-style playoff with as many as 16 teams we're hearing today could be playing in this, which I don't have a problem with for this crazy year. I'd hate to see it going on in a 162-game season. But that's what's going to happen. We're probably going to have a 2-month season, you know, maybe 60 games in 70 days is something that I've heard we're going to have, and then a sort of a mad dash playoff that everybody kind of hopes will be done in October, no matter what the posturing of the sides is, because they're all worried about a second wave. So here we are, right where we started.
Awesome. So Steve, you also report on this stuff. Do you have a different take on this, or a take on this?
Well, I'll pick up where Craig left off to some extent. By the way, I'm Steve. I am a writer and editor at Baseball Prospectus. My official title is consulting editor, which means that I sort of pop up like Sir Alec Guinness to the editor-in-chief and nag him about different things, which he is then free to ignore. And I write things that today got the attention of the National Review. So that's fun to be back in those crosshairs again. But I guess I'm also known for hosting the Infinite Inning. One of the really frustrating things about the negotiations that we've gone through over the past couple of months is that first the as Craig said, the owners negotiated this agreement that was poorly drafted and that they apparently were not happy with. And I'm probably the last person who should be criticizing contract drafting work. But I've known enough lawyers in my life who like to talk about the four corners of the document and how dangerous ambiguous language is. And it seems like, not that we've seen it, but that both sides went away with a different understanding, or the people who negotiated the agreement on the baseball side have been lying to ownership, trying to cover their own failure to write that agreement properly. But one of the really disturbing things about all this is that even when they resolved the monetary issue, the plan to deal with the possibility of COVID-19 is roughly tantamount to what the Trump campaign has planned for the Tulsa rally, which is to ask the players, please don't sue us when you get sick. And so they put the horse before the cart, the cart being the one where people go through the streets chanting, bring out your dead, because this was the most important thing, was safety, and not just for the players who could get sick and are more likely to recover given what we understand about the virus, but the many older people, managers and coaches and personnel who make this game function. And so there's a real danger of that. And there's a moral question for all of us as baseball fans who would obviously love to see this game back, how many people you are willing to have suffer so that you get it back. And just closing, the thing that I really wonder about as we theoretically leave this period of negotiations is the long-term damage to the game, because the owners in particular have both revealed themselves as being incredibly venal, but have also, for many people, as usual, and they've been doing this for 150 years, successfully portrayed the players as greedheads, even though it was the players who were abiding by the agreement that the owners themselves negotiated. And since the players are the product, they really should be partners. There is no baseball without the players. There may be a chicken factory without, the same people cutting the chickens every year, but that's not true in baseball. And so every time they do this, they hurt the game. And we really, even if we do get some kind of season off here, may in the future see additional declining interest because of the degree that they've trash talked their own product.
Yeah, difficult words to hear. Frank, what's your take on this and what's going on right now?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Frank Guridy, professor of history and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. I'm really happy to be here to talk baseball, right? Although this kind of conversation or this kind of talking baseball is different than what we're used to, I suspect. Remember when the baseball world was up in arms about the Astros cheating scandal? That doesn't seem very significant.
Still upset. Yankees fans still upset.
Yes. Many people were upset, and I was dismayed for a variety of reasons. But I'll put that aside. I want to approach these questions, picking up on some of the things that Steve is already alluding to from an off-the-field perspective, right? To think about how Major League Baseball is going to be affected by the pandemic, not just in terms of reopening, but also by the questions that have been raised by the Black Lives Matter protests and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, right? Because I think we're in a moment now where the game, even as it's reluctant to sort of engage in these discussions, although today there was an interesting panel with on MLB.com with on being black in baseball. It was an interesting conversation, right? But I think as baseball moves ahead, or as it's dealing with what's going on, it's going to have to reckon with the inequities and the disparities that the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests have exposed, right? And indeed, not just Major League Baseball, but the sporting world as a whole, and the NBA, the WNBA, MLS, the NCAA, and of course, the National Football League is going to have to examine its own complicity in the hierarchies that have been exposed by the pandemic, right? And the militarization of society that we've seen in the militarization of police forces. Right? Teams in the league are not going to be able to, I don't think, ignore the kind of questions that are being posed right now, the political and social and cultural questions. The notion that we're going to go back to normal and that baseball is just going to be that kind of psychological, feel-good cultural product that we go to forget about society, I think, and we'll come to this later, I think that relation is going to be reconfigured as a result of what's been happening now, right? So as Steve was already suggesting, the ongoing battle with the virus, right, means that the process of reopening is a life and death issue, right? For the players, for the managers, for the coaches, and even if it's a smaller staff of workers, essential workers who make game day possible, even when there are no fans in the stands, right? And so, therefore, the reopening question, as we've seen already outside of the sporting world, is going to be inherently a political question. And I think that one of the things I hope is that when we think about baseball's place, that we examine its role in the hierarchies that have been constituted over the last 25 years, and certainly since 9/11, right? And that baseball does more than just do the formulaic tribute to the Jackie Robinson, put out empty diversity statements, develop facile Latino, Noche Latino marketing schemes, right? I think that baseball's gonna have to do more than that as it seeks to repair itself from the damage that we don't even see happening, that we're going to see happening. I think that we don't even see yet, right? So it's a whole host of social and political questions that the baseball world is pushed into right now, and I think that pushing process is going to continue.
Thanks, Frank, for that. Appreciate it. Lincoln, what's your take on this?
My name is Lincoln Mitchell. I teach a little bit at Columbia. I write books about baseball and about politics. I'm a political scientist. I do a few other things. And I'm also a lifelong baseball fan. And I found in the last 3.5 years that when I speak on panels or on television shows, I often begin my comments with, I'm not quite as optimistic as the people who spoke before me. And that, unfortunately, that holds today as well. I'm not confident we have this season. I think that today is a speck of good news, but it can go a lot of different ways from here. I'm very pleased that the other panelists brought this up because we're getting back to whatever was normal post-corona is presented in the media and so much of the policy world as a logistics puzzle, right? How do you get the X and the Y and the this and the that, as if people aren't going to be dying, right? And we as a society, not baseball, but in general, seem to have accepted that, we're going to have about usually most days between 700 and 1,100, and then we'll have a second wave, and we'll be at 250,000 by the end of the year. That's deaths I'm talking about, and somehow that's okay. I don't think that's okay, and I think that disrupts society in ways that will have an impact on baseball, whether we want that or not. But there's a couple other things that come to mind. One is a very practical one. For me as a baseball fan, in pre-COVID days, if I just want to see, and I'm fortunate, I live in New York City, if I just want to see baseball, and I've done this, okay, I'm a little bit of a nut, but I can stroll over to Central Park most weekday afternoons and see a high school baseball game, right? Both my kids played youth baseball, so I can see them, but I could also see other teams. But what draws us to Major League Baseball is the idea of the season, the story, the playoffs, the records, all of that. And in a 60-game season, we as fans have to approach it as something else, because it is. And those who provide that something else, in this case, the owners and the players, have to think about it that way, and they're not. So I think that still seems to be a problem. I just want to read one quote. Right as I was preparing for this, I was on Twitter, and I came across this quote by Marco Rubio. Now, admittedly, Marco Rubio is, he's perpetually the smartest guy at the Middle School Young Americans for Freedom Conference. Nonetheless, let me read you this quote. America really needs some unifying common experiences right now, not to distract us from our challenges, but to remind us of the things we have in common. Baseball can help fill that void, and I am cautiously optimistic we will #play ball very soon. Now, I happen to disagree with Marco Rubio on almost everything, but that notwithstanding, does anyone believe that anymore? That's been baseball's story for a century. And I think it's been told to the breaking point, and it doesn't fly anymore. And the macro challenge for baseball, to go to some of the things Steve said, is how does baseball rebuild itself as a relevant, lucrative and popular institution after all these changes in the world over the last, 6 months, to which it has been a little tone deaf.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, as someone who has actually been watching the Korean Baseball League at 5:30 in the morning, I can tell you it doesn't quite have the narrative arc of Major League Baseball in my life. So I'm going to sort of segue now into a little bit what's already been started, we started to talk about anyway, which is how baseball has been impacting you personally, because I think for all of us it's been, hard, even though, yes, I mean, I'm very torn because I'm dying to see baseball. Sorry, that was a bad way to put it, but also share your concerns, Lincoln. And how has it impacted your work, since you all work in the field of baseball in some form or another? And I'm going to start with Frank on that one.
Great opening comments. So I'm just going to keep us going. Inevitably, sports discussions seem to inevitably slip into the autobiographical. So I will do that here. So I'm a child of working class Afro-Dominican, Puerto Rican parents growing up in 1970s, 80s New York City. I was the grandson of a Dominican immigrant who was a baseball fanatic, who, spent much of his youth traveling around the Caribbean following the Serie del Caribe, and the story that I've been told in my family was that my way of becoming a boy and a man was through baseball. At least that was part of the thinking and then teaching it. And I actually took to the game. I actually played it. I was one of the sports I could actually play. And I think as I was coming up in the Bronx in that era, this is sort of the tail end of baseball as an inner city phenomenon or grassroots phenomenon, right? And you could sort of see it dying even in my high school years as playground basketball sort of took over. And yet, I have experienced throughout my life the power of the baseball sporting congregation. And I'm using a term congregation here that Derek White, who's a historian of HBCU college football, has used recently, right? The way in which it pulls people together, maybe not in the way that Marco Rubio described, but certainly among working class Black, Jewish, and Latino communities in the Bronx, I saw that all the time. In our communities and even at Yankee Stadium, actually. And so I came to appreciate the power of the sporting congregation. It's something that I talk about and teach about in my own work in my sport and society class. And it really compelled me to think about baseball's relationship to the freedom struggles of the 60s and 70s, right? Certainly in the decades after Jackie Robinson breaks the color line in 1947. And yet that sporting congregation, I don't see represented in mainstream Major League Baseball circles, certainly, right? You don't see it at the ballpark anymore as baseball became more loyal to the gentrifying classes that predominate stadiums, certainly in New York City and throughout the country. I mean, one has to just, if you attend the NYFC soccer game and compare that to a Yankee Stadium and compare that crowd to the Yankee crowd at Yankee Stadium, you see a big difference in terms of demographic, in terms of generations, in terms of diversity. And so to some degree, I felt almost indifferent to baseball lately because I feel like it's gone for a different demographic. And I think that management has to do a better job of connecting it to the 21st century America that we're seeing on the streets today. And so, when I tell the history of the sport, when I write about it and teach about it, I try to bring those issues together so that a younger generation can see the power that baseball did have in catalyzing social change in terms of race and class and ethnicity. And I think that that's something that the game has to kind of rediscover somehow. And maybe this moment will allow us to do that.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting if we can talk later if people have ideas about how they can do that. Lincoln, how's it been impacting you? I know you said you have two sons who are very good baseball players.
Right, and they've stopped playing baseball for
Really?
a whole range of reasons. One of which is that baseball for young people is this odd. If you're a middle class American, I'm a middle class American Jew who grew up playing sandlot baseball. The last generation plays sandlot baseball in the town that gave us the word sandlot. But none of their friends play baseball. It's like when I was growing up, if you were interested in opera or something, right? It was a very obscure interest, and I think that reflects. For me personally, on the one hand, my work is largely with baseball history, so I've spent much of this this pandemic period fact checking a book about baseball from the 70s and 80s. So going back and because I have to because if you say that Kevin Mitchell caught that ball in the third inning and he caught it in the second inning, people crush you on Twitter. So you got to get it absolutely right. So doing a lot of that. And that's always been my interest in baseball. So for me, as long as there are baseball books, and I've read some very good ones and I have some more on my shelf, that I want to get to, there's always baseball. But there also is the ritual of it. And for a lot of people who, for whatever reason, making it from day to day, week to week can be a challenge sometimes, baseball provides that. That ritual is important. And that's really what I miss. I mean, I don't miss discussing, can the Giants make it into third place this year, right? And I don't really miss, the endless, Garrett Cole loses a game and the tabloids, he's overpaid for a week. I don't miss that so much, but I do miss the ritual of reading the box scores, of checking, is anyone going to get, how so-and-so's paced to 3,000 hits or 300 wins. So that ritual aspect for me is important. But again, the question is that, baseball has both well and at times poorly adapted to a changing world. But the changes, I mean, if you want to look just at the, I have a piece I want to write that says, defund the police is a great slogan, because the kind of right has decided it's a bad slogan, yet we're seeing real progress. And it's because of a slogan like that. And I think this is a time when the world is changing so fast. And because baseball is gone now, right? Not mishandling it, not being tone deaf, but just gone at the playing on the field. It has to come back. And I think its re-entry into our consciousness is going to be a little more difficult than we assume.
Yeah, I realize, of course, how much I enjoy baseball, but I never quite, appreciated how much it dictates the rhythm of my life. And it's just sort of the background that, we're sort of realizing that now. Steve, how's this been for you?
Well, let me try to tie together something that you said and Frank said and Lincoln said. It's caused a lot of soul searching, because I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm sort of the world's most ambivalent baseball writer. I didn't necessarily, I always knew I would be a writer, but I did not necessarily grow up wanting to do this. And as fun as it's been to be in clubhouses on occasion and play reporter and get to be around some of the people that I really have enjoyed watching play growing up. Reggie Jackson laid hands on me one time. It was more of a dismissive experience than a religious one, but I just happened to bump into him in the clubhouse and I said, "Hey, Reggie, can I have a moment of your time?" And he actually sort of took me and swung me like a door and walked past me without ever saying a word. I've had two experiences with him. I understand that's typical, but it does seem to be a thing that is sort of ebbing. And I saw this, Frank alluded to the demographics of Yankee Stadium, and due to a friend of mine, and this is not anything that is not public knowledge, but as they were going to design and build the current ballpark, they shrunk the number of cheap seats, so to speak, and favored these sort of plutocrat Wall Street only seats. And that was an explicit thing that they did because they thought that was how they were going to make money, not on the average person walking up and buying tickets, but like brokerages buying these seats. And I had an opportunity. You note that a lot of them are empty on a lot of game day broadcasts. I had the opportunity, due to yet another friend of mine who worked there, to sit in the legend seats with Jay Jaffe, and it was like they were all you can eat seats. So there were just constantly people bringing you food. There was also a pantry that you could walk to and just grab more food yourself. And it was towards the end of the season, and I had this experience. They had laid out all this candy. I guess I don't know if they did this every game or what, these like factory size or Costco size boxes of M&Ms and things like that. And as the game ended, there were people at those tables with a bag, just scraping them in. They were going to just take them home as part of their ransom for being there. And that's not kind of the crowd I want to be in. There are literally walls between those sections and the other walls, or the other sections, excuse me. the thing that Lincoln said, I also am primarily a historian. I will often comment on the current game, but what I try to do and do a couple of times every week on the podcast is use the past to relate it to the present. And what I've wondered, and this goes back to what you said, Tova, about the KBO, the reason that I don't find the KBO engaging is not because it isn't real enough baseball. It very much is. But I don't have the plot lines. I don't know what the stories are. Major League Baseball is this incredible serial that American culture has invented that goes back like 150 years. And so it's very easy for even the most casual fan to relate what is happening in a game today, what Mike Trout does to what Babe Ruth did, to what somebody even earlier did, Pete Browning, I don't know. And so we don't have that, and it's harder to connect with it when it's an abstract thing. Notwithstanding what Lincoln said, that it's great to walk through the park and just come upon a game. And just what I wonder is, as I continue to tell these stories, if baseball doesn't have an ongoing story to tell, if we don't really have a real season now, if they have damaged it in the future, will the stories about Pete Browning or Babe Ruth or Mike Trout continue to have resonance for people? And will they continue to have resonance for me? I don't really know.
Right. Okay. And Craig, last of all, you've remained busy for sure, but what's your impression of how it's impacted you and the work? And maybe even you can touch a bit on how this is impacting baseball journalism.
Well, I have a very different mindset on this kind of stuff than Stephen or Lincoln does. I'm not a baseball historian. I'm a day-to-day baseball writer, and during the regular season, the first thing I do every morning is I do recaps of all 15 games from the night before. So, bam, no games, none of that. I have lots of other things to write about. I have labor things, I have business things, I have all kinds of stuff, but the day-to-day stuff is all gone. And I'm lucky enough where I work that I could write about anything I want. And I found stuff. I've done some history things. I've done some other stuff. In journalism right now, a lot of people have said that they perceive the mainstream baseball press to be sort of rooting for the game to come back, irrespective of the dangers of the game coming back, or irrespective of the problems with the game coming back. And they say that a lot of these people are in the bag for ownership or Rob Manfred. And there is some of that, but I think a lot of it is a function of these are people that have nothing else to do, right? Their job every day, a great number of the baseball writers that you follow and how you perceive the game come from going to a ballpark 160 times a year and reporting on the game. They don't have that. So it's been a huge problem in media, and that's before you get to the problems of, can media make a go of it anyway? Newspapers are in deep trouble. Even The Athletic, which is the great hope of baseball journalism and sports journalism in general, laid off some people. So it's an extraordinarily stressful time for people who cover the game. They don't want your tears, don't worry. I'm not trying to give a sympathy ploy for them, but it is. So it affects everybody who covers the game on a day-to-day basis in a pretty straightforward way. Now, personally for me, it's a little different than most of those people. My parents weren't into sports. I grew up playing a little bit of sports, but no one really pushed it on me. Most of the places that I grew up were not baseball towns, and I've actually never lived in a major league city in my entire life. I lived in DC for 3 years before the Nats were there, but other than that, I've never lived in a town with a major league baseball team, so I've never been surrounded by baseball fans, at least serious hardcore baseball fans. I got into this business because I was practicing law, and as a side escape, I was blogging anonymously about baseball. It was a secret. It was my secret that no one else that I knew in my life knew that I was doing it for a while, until I stupidly used my real name and ended up, crashing my legal career. But that ended up working out okay. But the point of that is, baseball for me, I don't have this connection that a lot of you guys have with it's part of this national consciousness. I mean, I understand the history of it very well. I know baseball's place historically in America, but I've never felt a big part of that. I've always felt like it's my thing. And to talk a little bit about what you were saying, Tova, of the rhythms of the season, I mean, that's where it hits me. I know it's Memorial Day because so-and-so has so many home runs. I mean, that's just kind of how I know the calendar, right? And at this point in my life, and especially having done this full time now for over 10 years, I don't know how to function on a day-to-day basis. I know that around 7:30, I'm going to turn on a ball game. And I know that if I'm not waking up super early the next morning. I might turn on a West Coast game at 10 or 10:30. All of that is gone now. I'm watching the Rockford Files and Columbo reruns every night, which is good. It's a good thing, but it's, you know, definitely taking me out of my rhythm. I don't know that baseball has that place in people's lives beyond hardcore fans, beyond people like us here who have thought long and deep about baseball. I don't know that America misses it. I know baseball fans miss it. I know people who cover the game miss it, and baseball players miss it. But I don't know that America misses it. And I see someone like Marco Rubio say something about baseball needs to come back. And I don't know him personally. I don't know if he's a huge baseball fan. He might be. So it might be a personal sentiment of his. But I also think there's a huge sort of disingenuous political business kind of imperative to say, oh, we need baseball back because, you know, some people want to distract us. Some people want a moneymaker. Some people want anything. But I think America can function just fine without baseball. And I think baseball doesn't quite realize it. And I think that's a huge problem facing the game right now of getting out of the mindset that we'll always be here. They'll always want us. And I don't think that's true at all.
Right. Yeah. No, you know, what's going to happen for the future is incredibly worrisome. So my last question is, so what have we learned, and we've talked about this a little bit, but what have we learned about the role of baseball in this country right now? What role it plays sociologically, culturally, psychologically for all of us? There's a lot of talk about it. You know, maybe it's just really going to be passed by all the other leagues, which are starting, you know, and are not having these issues. And in some ways, you know, going back to what Frank was talking about, have dealt with the recent protests and the discussion of race in America, have dealt with it much more openly and expansively and in a deeper way. So, you know, what do we take away from having now lived several months without a baseball season and without baseball? I'm going to start with Lincoln on that one. Sorry.
So I'm sorry, I was doing something with the Zoom. Repeat the gist of the question very quickly for me, if you would.
It was
last sentence.
Really long. No, just about you know, what the total absence of baseball for the last several months has sort of taught us about what role baseball plays in the country. And I was also bringing up the fact that maybe, you know, we're talking about baseball just really declining, concerns about it for the future. And, you know, I was also sort of noting that the other leagues are starting. And, you know, I'm not the biggest basketball fan, but I can't wait until July 30th at this point, you know. But they've also dealt more honestly and more, you know, expansively with the, you know, the protests going on right now and so on.
So just on the basketball, when I moved back to New York from San Francisco, whenever people would talk about basketball, I would end the conversation by just saying, I'm a Warriors fan. That worked for the first 20 years or so, then it stopped. But, you know, as the Black Lives Matter demonstration uprising began, I began asking myself this question, in all honesty, because I was preparing for this panel. I wanted to begin to think about it because I was we were organizing it at that time. And what struck me is that if baseball were going on right now, it would be very challenging for MLB for some of the reasons Frank discussed. And just to kind of underscore that the demographic that watches baseball is older, white, male, and conservative, right? We saw what happened at Cardinals games in 2014, right? But then I had another thought, which is at the big league level. You know, if you look at where major league players are from, the Americans, right, tend to skew white and Southern. As much as there's not a lot of kind of liberal Jews from the west side of Manhattan or, you know, Noe Valley or, you know, somebody with two moms from Bernal Heights or something playing in the major leagues. And that also creates tension. I mean, go look at Aubrey Huff's Twitter feed, right? And I'm just picking on Aubrey Huff because he's a former Giant, but there's a few of those guys. And I was reminded, I had an interview for a book with a retired major league star, right? Someone who played in all-star games, was a star, won awards, the whole bit. And he was African-American. And he was talking about some of his challenges with one of the executives on one of the teams who he played, where there was a racial dynamic that he thought that he did not, that was hurtful to this player. and he was explaining it to me. So I asked as a follow-up, I said, I got to ask you a question. You know, you're an African-American guy. He happened to be not from the South, from an urban setting in the North. I'm trying to keep him anonymous because he asked us to be off the record. And most of the white guys who you play with are Southerners who have very different views on politics. I mean, this guy, you know, than you might. How did that affect you as a player? And he looks at me, and we were eating a meal. He looks at me, is silent for a long time. And then he says, I think you need to ask me the next question. And out of respect for, you know, his not wanting to create a problem, I just moved on to the next question. But it was clear he was upset and he didn't want to say anything that would get himself in trouble. And the reason I raise this is because one of the issues that baseball has to wrestle with is that there is an emerging, I'm being optimistic. We have seen changes. We have seen people speaking about race in America the last 3 weeks differently than any time that I can really recall in my life. And I'm not being Pollyannish about this. I think this is significant. And there's an assumption that many are making that all of these organizations that are saying, you know, I don't know, turning their Instagram to a solid black square last week or putting that statement out, that they actually mean it. But Major League Baseball, and this is not a generic criticism of baseball, but it's a real one, would struggle to mean it, right? I mean, those of Steve and Craig and others who write about sports more or less full time have been told undoubtedly more times than you can count, stick to baseball or stick to sports, not politics. I occasionally get told stick to politics, stop writing about baseball. But that's unusual, right? But what we've now, a good chunk of I don't think a majority, but a good chunk of the American people realize there is no stick to anything because politics is everywhere. As long as now that we're going to really try to wrestle, some of us, with these deep racism and deep racial inequalities. And for any institution, including Major League Baseball, that raises enormous challenges. But for baseball, those challenges are even greater. So where would we be if we had baseball now? What happens when baseball comes back? I think I keep going back to this. Baseball is coming back to an America that will have been changed by a pandemic that by the end of this year will kill 250,000 people, right, in America. That's the low estimate. If we have let's just say magically, a vaccine in March, as Donald Trump would say magically, a vaccine in March, opening day, late March as usual, that number will be up to 300,000. It will have had in my view, significant uprising around the core issue of American political life since the early 1600s. We don't know where that will land, but we know that's what's happening now. And America's dalliance with authoritarianism will either have consolidated or it will have ended, or it will have been at least stopped for a while. And either way, that will be traumatic to the society. And coming back after all of that will raise challenges for any institution that has been gone for this long. And I don't see Rob Manfred as the kind of most sophisticated, sensitive, deft political actor to lead baseball through this period.
Thank you for that, Lincoln. That was a really amazing analysis, I think. So I will turn it over to Craig to speak to this as well now.
I think Major League Baseball, no one would admit it. If you ask them point blank, they would deny it. But I'll bet you Rob Manfred, owners of 30 teams, 1 million executives, player agents, and a whole lot of players would tell you that, if they were being honest, that they're happy baseball isn't going on right now because they would have no means whatsoever, no ability whatsoever to go on to deal with what's going on in the country. Most teams sponsor a law enforcement appreciation night. They don't have an answer for what they would have done midstream to cancel that, alter that, change the messaging on that if they continued it. They don't want any part of that, and they haven't even considered how to deal with that yet. They're just happy they don't have to do it this year. Players who would be asked about it, I mean, baseball players more so than any other professional athletes give stock answers, give cliches, don't want to say anything controversial. They would be, using every bit of their power to stay away and moonwalk away from even the most benign questions about what's going on in the world. When they say baseball could come back and it could help the country, they're all looking through the lens of 9/11, right? And baseball, they want giant American flags, military appreciation. That's, maybe they don't want that, but that's what they're thinking of in the back of their mind. They're thinking of, that's how we deal with it. That's how baseball turns to stuff to deal with problems, is we double down on our patriotism and our jingoism. And that's obviously not the move right now, but baseball doesn't have a second move, at least, in my lifetime. I don't think baseball is in any way prepared to deal with what's going on in the world. I think they are all just hoping that, whatever this season is, plays itself out and no one asks any tough questions, and that by March it all goes away. It's not going to. But I also think that when they start to wrestle with these questions, if they start to wrestle with these questions, they're going to find them much harder for themselves to answer, for the reasons Lincoln stated, for its demographics, for its culture, for everything else, than any of this labor stuff they've been fighting over for the last 3 months.
Yeah, and someone raised in the chat room, and I have thought about this before also, about, hearing rumblings of Latino players having similar issues when all of the, kids in cages and all the immigration issues have been coming up over the last couple of years about not wanting to say anything too controversial about it. I was at an event with Omar Minaya and really I had a whole conversation with him about it, that the Latino players were really afraid to speak up in any way because of the other guys in the clubhouse, basically. Frank, what's your thinking?
I have no thoughts about this whatsoever. No, I have many thoughts. So when you're a historian of the Black freedom struggle and the struggles of the dispossessed, you can go easily to the history of exploitation and exclusion, but you grow to appreciate the history of what could be possible. And so my comments are actually going to come from that space, because Major League Baseball is really no different than any institution in this society that insofar as that no authorities or few authorities have been prepared to deal with what's going on right now, in the sporting world and outside. Even the woke NBA is not necessarily prepared for what a reopening is going to look like, even as they seem to be more forward thinking around these questions, right? So, I mean, we're all in a moment of reckoning. And I think, so to some degree, Major League Baseball, I think Craig and Lincoln are absolutely right, at the leadership level doesn't seem to have any sort of sensitivity to it, but it could. How about it, right? How about if baseball, follows what we're seeing out there right now, right? Because I think to some degree they're no different than the NCAA or any other sporting entity that has been profiting from the labor of dispossessed peoples for a long time, right? And I think that's the key point. So long as these sports rely on the labor of underpaid or unpaid college athletes in the case of the NCAA, or certainly in the case of Major League Baseball, you're talking about a well-paid labor force, right? But we're talking about major leagues. We're not talking about minor leagues. And even those who are Latino, I'm so glad you raised this point. Adrian Burgos is on this call here. He's the distinguished historian of Latinos in baseball. He knows this better than I do. So long as Latinos from poor Latin American countries are a significant part of the labor force, so long as these questions of exclusion and exploitation will come up, even when the players don't want to raise them or not. So I think some forward thinking would go a long way to help sport baseball move along with where the society is moving. Starting with the discontinuation of militarism and law enforcement nights, which is not a disrespect to our servicemen, but to foreground all the essential first responders that are keeping this country afloat over the last 4 months or so, 3 or 4 months, right? To actually take the Black Lives Matter seriously and make that part of its symbolic representation in the ways that some other leagues and teams have done. To highlight the experiences of Latino ball players in the communities they come from, right? I mean, we're focusing on the U.S., but, baseball's a global game. And its players come from the societies that have been affected by the pandemic in Latin America and certainly in Asia, right? There's all sorts of stories that I think baseball can foreground by going to its players and encourage them to speak from a space of honesty. I know this sounds utopian, but this is what I would like to see. I would like to see a Kaepernick, a LeBron James, and Megan Rapinoe figure champion the desires of those who are among the baseball fan. I think that there's a way to sort of expand the baseball fan base in ways that it has in the past. And a Curt Flood figure or somebody like that. There are folks out there in its own history that have stood for many of the issues that many people are calling for now, right? And so in order to do that, you have to diversify the game, not just at the level of coaches and managers, but the people who actually run the game, right? The sabermetric revolution, the advanced analytic revolution has completely taken the game away from the baseball lifers. Many of them who were Latino and Black, who really have no place in the game today, or very small place, right? So I think there's some possibilities there. And I think if the game is going to survive, it's going to have to do things like this in order to make it, to continue to make it relevant.
I'm going to let Steve wrap up the conversation and then get to a few of the questions that people have been raising in the chat room, which has been really active. You guys should know. And then, you can keep putting questions in the chat room if you want to while we're doing this. But Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. This is a wonderful turnout, and I'm well, not thrilled to be batting last here following all of these incredibly erudite and thoughtful answers. We mentioned several times earlier the Marco Rubio tweet from this afternoon, and I think maybe in part that stood out for everyone because, it's like the old Reese's peanut butter commercials with, what is this chocolate doing in my peanut butter? What is this demagogue doing in my sport? But, what he said was, well, we need baseball back, not as a distraction, but yeah, as a distraction. And the last thing we need, and I think everyone has alluded to this in one sense or another, is another opiate. Our lives overflow with distraction. I can remain at this desk and access virtually every movie, book, video game, song, Twitter thread, YouTube video, anything really that's ever been made. I don't have to leave the house to do that. And yes, we're all missing the exterior things, the things that we did leave the house to do, at least in the states that have truly shut down. But we don't need any other distractions. I keep thinking of Odysseus and the Lotus Eaters. We're the Lotus Watchers. And if baseball is going to function that way, when we have, as Lincoln ticked off, as everyone has ticked off, a pandemic that is going to kill at least 200,000 Americans by the time it really cools down. We have this conversation about race and policing and white on black violence, which is way overdue. And then we have a presidential election, which, to borrow from Abraham Lincoln, will either nobly save or meanly lose the last great hope of earth, or however he put it. And to the extent that we distract ourselves from those things, we're going to lose the thread. And I have this concern about that. When I was at SB Nation, where I was an editor for, a number of years, they used to say, as kind of company policy, sports is tribal. That was something that we were supposed to lean into, to stoke the divisions between people, to say that Yankees were better than Mets and Dodgers were better than Giants. I haven't had that kind of interest, if I ever have, in a very long time, and I was never comfortable with it. In part because, again, the great thing about baseball is community, but to make it us versus them is a very pernicious thing that spills into people's behavior, as we've seen in other areas of their lives. And I felt like it was immoral to raise that. And so now you bring baseball back, and we don't need that kind of enforced primitivism where, we have one group rooting for a different color pajamas essentially than the other group. And as Craig said, baseball does not, the people who run it don't have an answer to this situation. And I noted, many people have noted, that when the pandemic plan that they had leaked, this is all, as I said earlier, gone by the boards as the discussions have become focused about money. They had carved out, despite the fact that there will be no one in the stands, room to continue playing God Bless America in the 7th inning. And I am not denigrating patriotism. I still love this country for all its flaws, and I think most of us still believe in different ways that, again, we're working towards a more perfect union. We're not anywhere near that. That's an infinite journey, and some groups are less there than others, which is a massive problem. But I remember a few years ago, and I'm not sure if I can get this right, that the Yankees were sued because their ballpark Gestapo was physically preventing people from using the bathroom They could not rise from their seats and leave the stands while the Yankees were playing this 80-year-old recording of a 100-year-old song by a woman, Kate Smith, who had been dead for 30 years. And somehow, listening to this tinny thing over the speakers, you were supposed to swell with patriotic pride, and your bladder was swelling too, apparently. And you couldn't go anywhere. And that's performative patriotism. It's not real patriotism to say you will stand at attention, you will stay here, you will wet your pants. And the problem with this that is different from everything that's come before this point is now, unfortunately, everything has been politicized. As Lincoln said, there is no stick to sports. Politics is involved in everything, and they are going to give aid and comfort to some of the most reactionary forces in our society simply by pretending and having the jets fly over as they do whatever form of opening day they do, and have the eagle flying from center field and a big unfurled flag. We have to, again, there's nothing wrong with patriotism, but we have to have a realistic talk about this. I'll close by saying G.K. Chesterton, the great British writer, said, responding years later to Stephen Decatur, the American, saying my country right or wrong is like saying my mother drunk or sober. Like, we have to get to that place where we can speak honestly about this. And baseball, through that tribalism, often, as much as it brings 40,000 people together at a time, or a fan base together at a time, reinforces those divisions, and we cannot afford that now.
Thank you guys all so much for this entire discussion. I think it's been amazing. It's been incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. So I will say that. And before I turn to some questions, a lot of people have been picking up, I think, on what has been already said by some of you, which is, do you think it makes sense to start the season? Should they start the season? And what happens if a player does get COVID? And how good would a short 50, 60, whatever game season even be? And so, anyone who wants to take a shot at that question, okay, Lincoln.
I mean, are you talking to the panel? I don't want to jump in.
Well, anyone who wants to.
I mean, so I have a prop here, which is a baseball, right? It happens to have emotional meaning, which I'll explain to you, Tova, off camera, but it's a baseball, right? And John Leonidakis, who was on this call on the Zoom, just made a short film. John's a documentary filmmaker who makes great films about, really, he makes other films, but for my purposes, for baseball. And he made a film about like what this means to people, right? And I don't know about you, but when I hold this in my hand, what I want to do is throw it, right? And ideally, there's this kind of American pastoral kind of cliche of, it's gendered, but parents playing catch with children, right? When they throw 80 miles an hour and don't tell you when the curveball's coming, it's not as fun anymore. But nonetheless, what I want to do is go out and play catch, right? That's what I love about baseball, right? I went to a game in Japan recently. I was very lucky to be able to do this. The guy next to me didn't speak any English, but when his team was losing, our team was losing, and I said, do we have anyone left in the bullpen? He knew exactly what I was saying, right? There is something magic about baseball, but that magic can be outside playing catch with your friend, your sibling, your child, your whatever, right? It can be losing yourself in a baseball book, losing yourself in baseball history, if you're some of us. This season does nothing to this season as it's being proposed, a truncated season with a weird playoff season. Ask how much you'll care if your team is or is not in the World Series, whatever they call it this year, right? That doesn't help baseball. It doesn't help the fans. And to pick up on Stephen's discussion of patriotism, it doesn't help America, right? The most valuable asset that, in terms of money, that Major League Baseball has is not the licensing right to baseball caps, right? Nor is it the television contract with, Fox or whomever. It is its place in American culture and society and ethos, and it is losing that. And this terrible pandemic it created an opportunity to regain it. The smart thing for baseball to do would have been to create some opportunity to give something back instead of figuring out how we can take. And for that reason, I just don't care if there's a season. I can't go to the game, right? Because we can't. I can't go to my friend's house to watch the playoffs, which is what I've done the last few years because I can't go to his house because he's 70, right, and has some health issues, and his wife has health issues, so we can't. So the things that I love about the game day to day aren't going to be there, and it's not going to fit that same way that, I don't know, those of us who are old enough to remember the 81 season, right? When you look at the back of a baseball card or baseball reference page from 81, you know any counting statistic multiplied by 1.5, right? It just, you learn that mental trick, 94 is about the same. You're just going to know 2020 didn't happen. And a 60-game weird season is more disruptive to the long rhythm of baseball history than no season at all.
If I could jump in on that one too.
Sure. And I should mention that, I mean, of course, technically speaking, we're here for an hour, but I also noticed that we haven't lost a single person among the participants. So we can stay here,
we have the Zoom for a while, so don't worry about that.
We've all been talking kind of cosmically for an hour, about great meaning and stuff like that. But I'm going to bring it back down, and this is in direct response to a question someone had in the group chat. I spent, to keep myself sane from late February until about 2 weeks ago, I wrote a diary every day on my website. I called it the Pandemic Diary, and it was where I put all my thoughts about all my obsessions about the pandemic down to a granular level of what my governor was saying every day, what the statistics said, how it was affecting my life and everything like that. And I got very sucked into that in ways that I know all of us are to some degree, but I think I probably got sucked into it a little bit more. And I had to back away from that a little bit just because it's a very dark place to be, to think about how many deaths if we do this versus how many deaths if we do that. But I still think very hard about how many deaths if we do this or that. I love baseball. It's my job. I don't think we should have a season. I spent a lot of time talking about how we could have a season, about what it would mean to have a season. And because what I write, I have to deal with all that stuff. But if I was, all of a sudden in charge of everything, I would just bang the season right now. I don't think that, our general national ethos with respect to the pandemic has been to just pretend it no longer exists. I mean, all of us on an individual level don't do that. We all wear our masks. We all worry about our loved ones. But as a policy level in our country, even, my governor was given high marks for how he was handling the pandemic for the first couple of months. Even he just turned on a dime in early May, and we just all decided that we were going to go back to normal. And you're seeing that everywhere. And if you're in certain bubbles on Twitter, you might see more outrage than other places about what's going on here versus there and the numbers and all that. But most of the country, I think, has just chosen to not care anymore on some level. I think playing baseball games, in addition to the danger it's going to present to a 62-year-old pitching coach and a 47-year-old clubby who had a history of asthma, I think it's going to set a terrible example of normality that even though we might need it as a country, psychologically speaking, I don't know how long you can be an extremist like this country is right now. I appreciate that. But I also think it's going to just enhance the whole dynamic of everything's fine, even if there are no fans in the stands. I think there's a non-trivial number of people who will die by virtue of a Major League Baseball season happening this year. And I get called a whiny, bleeding heart liberal or a, sympathetic person or a, overly emotional person, but I can't not think of someone who's going to die because we decided that we just have to play baseball, and I wouldn't have the season if it was up to me.
You guys have made incredibly persuasive cases about not going back to baseball, which makes, I bet, a lot of people here, including myself, feel really guilty about those moments where I'm standing.
I don't want anyone to feel guilty. That's the thing.
No,
I meant to.
I have to. But I live about 2 blocks from National Stadium, and I stand outside the stadium when I go to walk my dog, praying to the baseball gods. But that's bad on me. Okay, so Steve, Frank, what do you think about yes, no, the season should happen?
No, I agree with Craig on a moral basis and Lincoln on a baseball purist basis, because someone who you would expect to hit 300 in a 60-game sample will hit 190 and vice versa. And maybe that's an extreme way of looking at it. But, I mean, think of in 1985, the Cardinals traded for Cesar Cedeno down the stretch, and he hit like 420 over 30 games. That's in the encyclopedia for forever, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just one of those weird little things that can happen when you truncate the season. If the 1986 season had ended after 60 games, Roger Clemens would have been what, 14-0 at that point, or he would have had sort of the most perfect season in baseball history. Maybe it was more like 12-0. I'm not pausing to look at the stats, but things are going to be wildly distorted. And to just sound a note of, I was thinking about whether this was an oxymoron earlier, justifiable paranoia. The owner's solution to virtually every downturn in the history of the game is to make the ball yet bouncier. And it is hard to explain, or I'm sorry, it is hard to believe that the ball could be even bounce. Hi, Meredith. I know this is your thing. It's hard to believe that the ball would be even bouncier than it is now, but I would not at all be surprised if they start the season and suddenly it's like the 1812 overture, every inning just balls zooming out of the park.
Frank, did you get to say yes or no? Oh, play or no?
I'll just jump in because there's so many great comments in the chat, and agree. I mean, as I was talking today, the question of whether it should reopen this season, to some degree is I mean, it's important, obviously, right? But I still think at some point baseball's going to come back in some form, right? And whenever that is, whether it's this summer or next year or whenever, depending on who's going to survive this situation. These are core questions that baseball have to face, the stuff that we've talked about today. And, I think that, hopefully there are some who are being reflective about what sport means in our society. And again, maybe I'm at that cosmic level that Craig is talking about, but I think that I'm inclined to think that, yes, I mean, I'm watching what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Asia, but, hoping that something can sort of come together, because clearly some people depend on this for income. But I think in the end, I think it'd be a mistake to bring baseball back this year. But I think that it's still going to have to come back in a different form whenever that moment is.
Yeah. Well, this has been amazing. I'm going to just very quickly bring up one more topic, and then I'm going to ask Lincoln if he wants to open it up to unmute people who are asking to be unmuted and stuff. But there was also a discussion at a couple of different points in time about the minor leagues, which, MLB was getting ready to, in my opinion, screw already. And now what this is all going to do in the minor leagues and how they're being treated. And then, Lincoln, I'll leave it to you as to if we should, open it up to people being unmuted. So anybody have an opinion on what's going to go on with the minor league baseball? And also somebody was asking about what that would mean for, sort of cultivating players of color and opening up the game to a wider range of young people.
Minor league baseball isn't going to happen. I'm friends with a guy who runs a minor league team in A-ball. They haven't been told anything official, but there's very little chance at all. They're not expecting to play at all, which it makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons, but not just for the big moral reasons I just beat my chest about, but for practical reasons as well. There's also a lot of bad sentiment among minor league baseball owners and managers and things like that, this was the worst possible time. I mean, there's never a good timing for a global pandemic, but it's horrible timing just with respect to, Major League Baseball's push to eliminate minor league teams. Just as a whole bunch of them are becoming financially unviable, Major League Baseball is going to cut them. It was probably going to happen one way or the other at this point. But yeah, when you have fewer minor league teams, which we will have fewer minor league teams going forward, and when they're less geographically diverse because they're going to be increasingly brought towards Major League Baseball teams' training places in Florida and Arizona, that's the plan. That's what they really want to do long term, is keep that stuff in-house as much as possible. You're just going to have a smaller footprint for baseball in the country. You're going to have fewer people who are impacted by baseball on a introductory level, as we have often talked about it with respect to minor league baseball. That's the first baseball a lot of kids see. It's not a good thing. Like everything else in Major League Baseball these days, there's a business argument for it, and there's a very large, sort of subjective argument against it, and the business argument's going to win.
Thanks a lot for that. And a lot of people are commenting that this conversation has been depressing, which it kind of has
I'm
been.
sorry.
I'm going to do something I never
Which I wasn't expecting either, because usually when we kibitz about baseball, it's a lot of fun and we're laughing and having good jokes. And I mean, that's one of the issues right now, right? That's one of the problems I'm having with baseball not being around is the talking about it and the reading about it and the different takes and, the back and forth and making fun of each other's points of view on things. And we're not really having that. So Lincoln, I want to ask you if you want to take over the host role and unmute people.
Okay, so what I have done is I have now said that anybody can unmute themselves. I haven't unmuted all, but you should be able to unmute yourself. I just want to make one comment about minor league baseball, though. I've never quite understood. I've been to minor league games. I've never quite understood it for some of the reasons that Steve said. I don't know the backstory. So for me, like I go to Staten Island to the Staten Island Yankees, it's not that different than seeing a high school game. It's certainly not that different than seeing a college game. You can identify one or two hot prospects. I'm not a scout. I'm not out there, trying to, listen to Up and In and trying to get a job as a scout. So for me, I think what's and there's always been this exploitative nature in minor leagues, right? On the one hand, we present it as the symbol of a pastoral, paradisical memory of America, and the other hand, we pay a lot of like Dominican people substandard wages to play this game at the minor league level. So I'm not crazy about that. I think that what we may see is because enough American people love baseball, that the absence of minor league baseball provides other ways for people to enjoy baseball. I don't think we're coming back to like every employer you're having a baseball team like in the 30s or something, but I can see that, high school baseball started, college baseball, neighborhood baseball, people just going out and playing ball. So I'm not happy about the end of minor league baseball. If minor league baseball weren't ending, it would have to be restructured because of the pay inequities, which are not addressed. So there's a lot there, but I do agree it's not coming. It's going to change. It's not going to be this year. It's going to change. And a lot of this, I mean, the one thing we haven't talked about is that a lot of the subtext of all of this is that the basic agreement expires in 2021. And that's what the owners and the players are thinking about now. And that's what's driving a lot of this thinking.
Can I add also that, we to the conversation being depressing, I was trying to think of ways that it wouldn't be depressing or to say something uplifting or to quote Casey Stengel, which is what I usually do. But I was just going back over the history of baseball in my mind. And do you realize how fortunate baseball has been that not all this stuff has come together in one place at one time before? That, yes, a minor league team, a team from Spokane, I believe, their bus went off a cliff and that team had to be restocked. That was in the late 50s. But it's not happened in like this big, like, you have to replace Yogi Berra and Mickey Mantle kind of way, which is not to diminish those lives that were lost, but they haven't had that. They haven't had a plane full of players go down. They haven't had an earthquake swallow Dodger Stadium whole. They just, in World War I and World War II, in World War I, they were so fortunate that the government forced them to play the 1918 World Series in September, because if they had played it in October, everyone would have gotten influenza and died.
This is supposed to be the uplifting part?
Yeah, I mean, it just hasn't. It's just sort of like they've been rolling sevens for 150 years, and this year they crapped out, as did we all. So no, this is not the uplifting part. This is, I can't find it, but it's like we were due.
Okay.
Sorry.
I do invite anyone on the panel or participants to say something.
I have something uplifting to say that refers to something Stephen said earlier. Does that help?
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Meredith Wills. I'm the one who does baseballs, like actually takes baseballs apart and has done it. So Stephen referred to me before. Based on what I've seen from 2020 spring training, yes, the ball is going to travel at least as far as last season, possibly further. It's a fluke because you can't actually like do a baseball on a short enough time scale. They would have been making them starting the middle of last season, but they knew that the ball was traveling further. Based on what I'm finding, it looks like this one at the very least, it's going to go as far. I need to get a few more baseballs, but there's a possibility it might go further. And, we'll see. It's not 2020 baseball yet. And let's put it this way. It's very likely that a lot of the ones that were made for this season are going to end up in 2021 anyway. So if you want home runs, and home runs are a good thing, we're going to have lots of them. So that's my good news. Does that help?
Oh my God, I'm not sure if I agree that's good news.
I'm trying.
I'll take it. At least it's about the game. Who else is gonna unmute themselves, or did you guys want to respond to any of that?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
I'm Michael. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm an actor, and I grew up 2 blocks from Yankee Stadium. And I'm old enough to have seen Joe DiMaggio play. Couple of thoughts. Frank talking about how seeing this white as cream cheese fan base at baseball stadiums. I think baseball, MLB can look at Los Angeles and San Diego, where 90 to 95% of their marketing budget for 25 years has been directed to the Latino marketplace. And their fans are packed. The Latino fans amount to over 50% of the crowd, even though it's exorbitantly expensive, which leads me to minor league ball. I can't afford to go to a major league game. It's too freaking expensive. But I can go to Temecula and Rancho Cucamonga, and I could take my grandkids and my great-grandkids and indoctrinate them and have them see a game and talk about it and explain what's going on and get a baseball cap and be branded. Without minor league baseball, it's pretty hard to do that.
I gotta tell you, Lincoln, there are a bunch of people in the chat room taking you up on this minor league baseball attitude.
No, I recognize this is my big city bias, you know?
You're not.
And I appreciate that. Like, I've been to the Cape Cod League, which I love. So just briefly to defend myself, but I want to be careful about over determining the story of minor league baseball. This is not, people out there playing for the love of the game. These people desperate to move up the ladder who are generally underpaid. And that's part of why you can afford it.
Well, without it, we lose the next generation.
Without affiliated minor league baseball.
Without
right?
any minor league baseball, we can't afford it.
If minor league baseball contracts, there may be a rise of unaffiliated minor league baseball, which was historically the best minor league baseball.
But
right?
those days of the St. Paul Saints, an independent minor league team that has moderate success, few and far between.
Yeah, because
from the teams.
Because they can't succeed when there's affiliated baseball everywhere. But if
I think you guys should take this to the chat room, actually, in a minute.
Okay.
We can get to other people, but it's a big topic. I mean, I agree.
The great thing about going, from my perspective, to the minor leagues, when I go as sort of a jaded person who, understands the top-downness of it, I kind of in my mind have this like, oh, this is all for development purposes. The game doesn't really have any integrity. I said that to Branch Rickey III at one point, who you'll be pleased to know has the eyebrows. That is a dominant gene apparently in that family. He was the president of all the minor leagues at that point, and I raised my hand and said that in a lecture prior to my becoming a professional, and his answer was essentially shut up. But the thing that's really cool when you go, and I've gone to games like the Johnson City Cardinals, which is one of the teams that I think is going to be wiped out under this agreement, which is in like this corner of northeast Tennessee / Southwest Virginia. And or just last year, I went to see the Biloxi outlet for the Brewers because I have family in that area. And whenever you go to a minor league game, there are people rooting as if it counts. Yeah. And I mean, I know they have playoffs, and I know that they have, they do go through the motions of having a pennant race, even though the cleanup hitter can be disappeared at any time. He can be brought up to the next level, or he can be called up to the major leagues. But yet people have sort of a willing suspension of disbelief that allows them to put aside that knowledge and just enjoy being there and rooting for the home team. And that's one of the ways that baseball is being very short-sighted, and one of the ways that Michael's comment is so welcome, because it's not just the expense of it. It's very easy to just sort of get into the no stakes fun of rooting it in that kind of environment.
I just want to jump in real fast. Again, I think much the conversation as it should be is about the challenges facing the game. But again, I think these are just bigger questions that all parts of the sports industry are facing, right? I mean, my colleague Adrian said in a chat earlier that he was struck by I think he said something like that his students at Illinois, aren't fans. I'm actually surprised at how a number of my students are actually younger. These are 20-year-olds or so are fans, and that may represent their own kind of Ivy League class privileges, perhaps. But in other words, there's various ways to engage in sport and baseball spectatorship. And I think that even as Major League Baseball, even if it declines in the way that we've known it, I suspect history suggests that people who are into the game will figure out ways to play and watch, and even if it's not in the form that we've been accustomed to in our lifetime. So I don't know if that's hopeful, but I'm not willing to sort of say that even if Major League Baseball declines, that's going to signal the end of the game as we've known it. I think it'll get reconstituted in different ways. I do. Although I studied the past, I know nothing about the future, so I'm just speaking off my head here.
I think the future. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I heard a comment today for baseball, the Major League Baseball version of baseball. For it to survive, it has to be destroyed. It has to burn down completely and be rebuilt, because the way it exists right now is completely dysfunctional and completely so conservative and so orthodox. It is the MLB, whoever you want to blame it on, they all have the Midas touch in reverse. They have tried to strangle this golden goose for years and years and years. I think they're finally onto something. And the problem is with the Major League game at this point, because of the sliding ratings, the fact that the game doesn't matter to millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, and it's all going to die with people like us who are watching here, age of 50 and older. If there is no season this year, this has really just shown Major League Baseball for the fraud that it is, completely dysfunctional and can't get out of its own way, strangling itself, self-suicidal. Yet the WNBA, the NBA, the NFL, they can figure out how to get it done. And Major League Baseball, the most dysfunctional party in the room, can't get their act together without tripping over their own 2 feet every 3 steps. And so if they don't play this year, you can argue it's a good thing, because the thing needs to get burned to the ground and needs to be rebuilt. On the other hand, this may finally be the mortal wound, the sword that they finally fall on to kill the Major League game in general. I still think not everybody, some people seem to forget that baseball lives in many other forms: little league, high school, college, minor league. We can get our fix in many other ways. I just think it's very disproportionate that so many people see Major League Baseball as the face of what Babe Ruth called the greatest game.
Don, tell us how you really feel.
No,
It's interesting because I hear that sentiment a lot from my readers and from commenters and people too. And sometimes I join in, and I sometimes fuel that sentiment as well, because I get just as disgusted with Major League Baseball as a lot of people do. But I also think it's possible to take that sentiment too far, because baseball has been on the brink many times. We talked about how lucky baseball has been, that it's always been there, and that's not always true. I mean, in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was open conversation about whether baseball is relevant. And if you go look at the attendance figures and you look at now all the owners say they're not making any money, but back then a lot of the owners didn't make any money. It was like, a pretty shaky proposition, and there was concern. It had been passed by football for a good 10 or 15 years at that point. There was concern about its future. It had a renaissance in the mid-70s. It dipped again. It had another renaissance in the 90s. It's been sort of rolling post-strike anyway ever since. It'll dip again. It's certainly in a bad place right now, I think. And I'm not, again, trying to have rose-colored glasses and say that, oh, don't worry, baseball will be fine. I agree on some level they do have to burn the edifice down. But I don't think that what's going on necessarily is terminal to baseball. And this sort of ties in with what Michael was saying earlier. I go to a lot of games in San Diego and LA too. I have family out there. So I've been to that park, both of those parks. I know that dynamic he's talking about. And it might also tie into the issues we're talking about, that I was talking about earlier, with baseball not knowing how to respond to this moment in time. There's a future in baseball. That future is a lot more Latino than the Major League Baseball edifice and leadership is. We need to bring people of color through the ranks and into the game in ways that we have actively not done and in fact pushed back upon for quite some time. Those marketing initiatives that work very, very well in places like Los Angeles can work in other places. I think baseball is certainly entering a period now of darkness, and there are certainly a lot of things that it has to do and is not guaranteed to not completely screw up. But I think there's a way forward for baseball. I just also don't think that the people who are running baseball are part of that way forward.
So, just to pick on something Craig says is very important. Just for example, in the early 1970s, and Frank, I'm sure you're writing a book on this, but you'd have more people at a high school, not on this specifically, but on this generally, at a high school football game in Texas than at a Rangers game on a Friday night, right? I mean, for much of baseball history, the shot heard around the world, 20,000 empty seats at the Polo Grounds, right? For much of baseball history, this was a small business. The relationship between what the top player was paid and what, the average household income was nothing like what it is today. There was much less money in the game. And moreover, Major League Baseball, which at the time was the AL and the NL rather than MLB like we have today, was one of essentially a panoply of ways that you could enjoy baseball. Some of it was because for much of the history it was segregated. So there were African Americans couldn't play, so there were the Negro Leagues, as we called them, so you could see that. The PCL, of which the Seals were really the dominant team, was on the West Coast. I mean, when I started going to, I've told many of you this, when I started going to Giants games in the 1970s, and Zed, I don't know if you're still on the call, but you were with me at some of those games. The people behind us, the old dudes behind us, like we had to know. They would tell us, we had big league baseball here before the Giants, right? Because of the Seals. There was semi-pro. There was barnstorming. There was the Caribbean. Now what we have is that capital B baseball is MLB. And when we talked about the minor leagues, we should understand, and I'm not against the minor leagues, but we should understand the minor leagues are a subsidiary of MLB. They're not an independent organic thing. So the question for me, for those of us who love baseball, and I assume if you've managed, at least 50 of you are good for over an hour on this conversation. If you don't love baseball, I don't know what you're doing on the Zoom. But for those of us who love baseball, I think we have to be open to it evolving in different ways, right? To the baseball that we consume changing. As late as, it's only really since the mid-90s, the best thing about baseball, MLB in the Bud Selig era, is that if you like MLB, is that the best players in the world were playing in MLB. But as late as the mid-90s, that wasn't true. And as late as the mid-50s, that certainly wasn't true. So it may be that baseball goes back to being what it always was, which is one of a variety of ways that people in the United States, the Caribbean, Asia, elsewhere can enjoy this game.
Frank, can I ask you a question? I'm curious because you brought this up both in the discussion and in the chat. The sabermetric revolution, the thing that Bill James started. No, I'm not just sort of as a baseball prospectus guy or whatever defending that. I'm interested in this perspective because to me, from my perspective as a writer and consumer, what that accomplished is that it rationalized the game so that we could look back in time and see the real value of a Ted Williams or a Roy Columbine who walked 150 times a year. Like we started to understand things like on base percentage instead of RBIs. So to me, that's very benign, but you seem to be saying that it's alienating to, and I know it was alienating to like a lot of older people, including various sports writers who spent the 90s literally raging against us sometimes. But is there sort of a deeper sociological aspect to this that you're alluding to?
Indeed, yes, there is. I'm conflating a bunch of things, right? Sabermetric, advanced analytics. I think in terms of the stubborn persistence of hierarchies at the management level in terms of who gets hired for managers, right? You're the ways in which the Epstein-Bean figure becomes, the person who runs franchise as opposed to the baseball lifers of earlier eras. I think it's reinscribed certain hierarchies that exist in Major League Baseball in terms of management, right? So, and then you see this very clearly in terms of playing out who gets hired, right? And who's the GM. And I think that's what I'm referring to. So on the one hand, it's benign insofar as it's giving us an advanced understanding of how the game works. But in terms of who gets hired, it has tended to privilege, I think younger college-educated GMs as opposed to people who, were the Frank Robinsons and even the Felipe Alous and people like that who really are not moving up. Or there's Omar Minaya, but there aren't that many of those in Major League Baseball, right? So. And so that's what I'm referring to, and I think again that's the baseball version of the kind of ways in which fans are encouraged to think about the game from the perspective of the GMs and management, and not from the perspective of players, right? So so even the way we evaluate players is based on this kind of depersonalized statistics that, in some ways, again, reinscribes certain affiliations in our spectatorship. So. That's what I'm referring to. And, so watching Dusty Baker struggle to get jobs or people like that, I attribute to some degree to this shift that we've seen in management. And I've even said this beyond baseball. I mean, what happens in the 60s and 70s is that you are seeing the influx of Black and Latino players in these leagues, but you're seeing the growth of the management class, right, as well, not just in baseball, but in other leagues as well, which is overwhelmingly white and male. So in some ways, it's a legacy of the realignments that we see happening from that era too. So that's what I'm referring to.
There is definitely massive privilege in this, and I bet Craig has seen this too, going to the winter meetings, that you see these huge cadres of generally young white men, and maybe it's changed because I haven't gone in a few years, and I think you still go every year, Craig, but if you talk to them, what are you doing here at the winter meetings? They're looking for jobs. And the jobs specifically they're looking for are internships, and they're on their third or fourth one. And they say, well, 2 years ago I worked for free for the Reds, and last year I worked for free for the Red Sox, and now I'm hoping to work for free for the Cubs. And obviously, if you're doing that and you're not 18 and still living on your parents' dime, but you're 25, 26, 27, whatever, first of all, it's very exploitative of baseball, and we know that. But second of all, you have to have a certain amount of cash or savings that enable you to afford to do that, to do this unpaid work for years in the first place. And obviously not everyone can say that.
And even if that was all not the case, even if it was all equal and everybody had equal means, which they don't, obviously, it definitely, as you said, and that crowd it's gotten somewhat more diverse in the 11 years I've been going to the winter meetings, but not really. It's still overwhelmingly sort of privileged, wealthy, white young men from, quote unquote, good schools who are able to float a couple of years of making no money for the hope of chasing their dream in Major League Baseball. But even if that was all even, the sabermetric revolution, as it were, whatever we want to call it, analytics, as you said, it's definitely a very privileged class. It's overwhelmingly white people, overwhelmingly people with either financial or engineering backgrounds that have really gotten into this on a professional level. And as is the case in any other system, people tend to hire people that are like them, right? So it's replicating itself over and over again. Theo Epstein, just like last week, I think, finally copped to the idea. It was like, you know what? I think maybe I've been hiring too many people that I see myself, right? That's what people do. That's systemic racism, right? And it just that's the problem that the sabermetrics revolution has sort of had. On a micro level, it's great, but on a macro level, it's causing all these inefficiencies.
I think there's another component of this as well. And I went back to watching, I remember watching the 2016 World Series where the Cubs won. Those of you from Chicago may have remembered that. And, Joe Maddon was celebrated as a genius, although he basically got lucky in that Game 7. He mishandled the pitching very badly in the last few games. But Joe Maddon is a genius because for too many white folks in America, smart people are white and wear thick glasses, right? Dusty Baker, I'm wearing thin glasses. But Dusty
I have no idea what you're talking about, Lincoln. I really can't tell you.
No, but Dusty Baker, who I think Frank mentioned, I know there are Giants fans who will never forgive him for Game 6 of the 2002 World Series. But Dusty Baker's managerial record is, in my view, as impressive as Joe Maddon's, is perceived as in a totally different way. We all know, if you know anything about baseball, that I'm going to use a technical term, Dusty Baker is a mensch. We know that about him. But I think that clouds out the fact that he's probably a really smart dude also. You don't manage that many teams to the playoffs, but to get to the bias implicit in sabermetrics, not just that you can get that MBA and then intern for 3 teams over 3 summers, although there is certainly that, right? But it is who looks like somebody who they'd be good with numbers. It's not the Dominican dude with dark skin and an accent, right? That's just not how white decision makers view the world. And that's impacting this also. And that impacts managerial choices because the managers got to be sharp on sabermetrics. And, Hensley Mullins, what does he know? Gabe Kapler, oh, of course. I really think there's some of that. And I think it is very much, I think the people making those decisions don't do it consciously, but it's there.
Adrian, I know your work as well, and I want to invite you to unmute yourself if you feel like it. No pressure. Are there other people who want to chime in about anything?
I just want to make this comment about statistics, and I love listening to Steve's podcast and learn all about sabermetrics. But I don't think the average fan gives a rat's ass about war. They're there to have fun and root for their team. And, everybody knows who LeBron James is, but nobody knows who Mike Trout is. Major League Baseball has done a shitty job in promoting its superstars, white and non-white, and they're losing an enormous opportunity and not getting these stars out there. I think I've heard it on Steve's broadcast. I don't know. But I do know it's not my original idea. But the fact that Mike Trout, questionably maybe the best player in baseball, and 98% of America don't know who he is, know what he looks like, is astounding to me. And the same goes with Latino and African-American ball players who are unknown in their communities.
Who else has got something they want to definitely say? Yeah.
The one thing about Mike Trout is he's pretty vanilla. I mean, he's just a solid guy. I mean, that's what everybody would like to be, a quiet guy, hits all the home runs, the storybook hero.
So is Mickey Mantle.
Yeah. Well,
Mickey Mantle was a lunatic.
I don't know if I'd compare those two. After hours.
Was a lunatic. Come on.
I'm not the first person
Mike
to
Trout is sober.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that we know of. But I mean, he's from a part of New Jersey where there's not much else to do but drink. But the other people have observed this, but I mean, it's hard for the owners to focus on promoting the game when they're busy denigrating it. And they have really gone out of their way, even over the last month. They were unhappy with the deal that they negotiated, and so they spent the last, 4 to 6 weeks talking about how the players were greedy and trying to keep baseball from the masses, and it's just not true. But it always works for some reason, and it always has worked. So how can you celebrate Mike Trout appropriately when you can't talk honestly about the help? So the help are the game. They're not the help. The owners are the help.
But I think this goes back to before Mike Trout, right? This goes back, I've been writing a lot about baseball in the 70s and the 80s for a couple of books, and I'm thinking of some of the great stars of that era. Reggie Jackson, Vida Blue, Bobby Bonds, Dick Allen. Are you seeing a similarity between these, what characteristics these players have in common besides being very good? And these were kind of second generation African-American stars. They were a generation younger than the Frank Robinson, Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, guys like that. And baseball decided, consciously or not, decided that they were all, the charitable way was outspoken, right? But it was also much more negatively portrayed than that. And I think that it was a very difficult time beginning with those kind of 70s era African-American stars. And that began to impact how they weren't interested in marketing these guys because they resented them. Someone else put in the chat, Ricky Henderson. Ricky Henderson was one of the greatest ball players ever. And let me tell you something, I'm not an A's fan, okay? I always say the A's are by far my second favorite big league team in the Bay Area. I've been watching baseball for well over 40 years. If you went, the most exciting ball player I've ever seen in my life was Ricky Henderson in 1980 and 1981. I would go to Oakland just to see him, and I don't like the A's. Ricky Henderson, Barry Bonds became the face of steroids, right? Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds hit more home runs, now I'm showing my San Francisco roots, hit more home runs against pitchers on steroids than anyone in the history of the game, right? He was the best player in the steroids era. But I think marketing African-American stars after about Willie Mays and Henry Aaron has been difficult. The only exception that springs to mind are Jeter and Jr. and Griffey Jr. And we'll see about Aaron Judge, but it's been difficult.
What makes it harder to also, live up to the moment that we now find ourselves in, because, the impulse is there. You mentioned, they're outspoken or they're hot dogs or whatever. Now you're seeing this happen with Latino players for a long time, of this whole play the game the right way kind of thing. And whether you're allowed to be demonstrative, whether you're allowed to be celebratory, baseball it's not just, obviously I know you know this, but it's not just the 70s. It persists in different ways. That sort of cultural hegemony of the be quiet, don't make noise, and be white kind of thing contorts itself over time. And so the next player of color who wants to be outspoken on social issues is going to, even after all that's going on right now, they're going to be attacked, or they're not even going to bother because they know that all of a sudden that becomes their persona in the mind of the baseball fandom, baseball media, baseball ownership. It's extraordinarily difficult culturally because of everything baseball has been for forever.
Yeah. And I would be clear by saying, I was very clear. This was, I know why they aren't, but I understand why. I was being a little smart-ass, but I understand why this is happening. Right?
Sure.
Lincoln, you'll be happy to know that there's a great conversation going on in the chat room about Bernie Williams.
I saw that.
Because we had a preparation call for this event. We just sort of started out with Lincoln starting to talk about whether Bernie Williams belonged in the Hall of Fame or not. And that's what got this whole thing started. So,
but another example to me, and Tova, you might be able to speak to this as well, is that for like 2005, 2015 ballpark, Robbie Cano and Dustin Pedroia were the two best second basemen in the American League East. Let me rephrase that. Dustin Pedroia was the second best second baseman in the American League East, and the way they were profiled in the media was like the same way it's always been. Pedroia worked hard. Cano was lazy, right? This was Texas.
Right.
And this was going on not that long ago. And I think baseball has a particular challenge. We talked about Latino players. A lot of when a lot of Latino players, I don't know, if a lot of them aren't citizens or become citizens. It's a challenge. It's a complicated relationship. And so I think this is and baseball was the first sport, I don't know enough about basketball and football to have large numbers of Latino players because it was so popular in places like the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and seemed wildly unprepared for that, right? You look at the coverage of the Giants in the early 60s, the first team to bring in, they got the best Latino players of the era, Juan Marshall, the Alou brothers, Manny Mota actually began with the Giants. And it was kind of axiomatic among a large chunk of the sports writers that, all those Latino players, that's why they always choke in the clutch. That was just accepted by a lot of white sports writers in the era. And I'm not sure how much past that we've gone. I just turned on, because we're all watching old ball games. Some of you may remember the game between the Yankees and the Red Sox, the one-game playoff. And Mike, and it's Guridy against Torres. What?
Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about that. It's Guridy against Torres. And Guridy, of course, goes in the game 24-3. Great record, great season. And they're saying, you're telling his stats. And Mike Torres, they describe him as the hot-headed Latin type, like on the television broadcast. And that wasn't that long ago.
I will say this. I happened to be standing in the Yankee Stadium dugout during one Old Timers Day that Mike Torres attended. And as they were about to, I don't know why I hadn't been cleared out of the dugout. I was still there for some reason. And as they introduced Mike Torres, I think it was John Starling said, this pitcher pitched for the Yankees and the Mets. And, of course, he's the guy who blew the 1978 playoff game, sending the Yankees to the World Series. It's Mike Torres. And Mike Torres, standing next to me, mumbles, "Never fucking let me forget about that." And then he ran out onto the field.
Showing once again how Sterling's a moron because, of course, Torres won Game 6 of the 1977 World Series that the Yankees won the year before.
And I believe he won 2 games in that series for the Yankees. I'd have to check that, but I believe he did.
He was also the guy who not purposely, I don't think, but destroyed Dickie Thon's career. That's how I always think of him.
Do you know who the Yankees got for him when they traded him to the A's? Or do you know how the Yankees got him? Who they traded to get him?
I probably do, but not off the top of my head.
Doc Ellis.
Oh, right.
Midway through the 77 season. Ellis had that great 76 year, which was really the Willie Randolph trade, but it was the Doc Ellis trade. And then he was traded in 77.
Throughout this Zoomcast, one of the things that I'm aching, I actually have angst. I'm missing at least 15 diversions from Steve. I miss those diversions.
The free associating I do, you mean?
You want to call it free association? Okay, that's politically correct. Thank you. You sound like a Republican. Thank you.
None of that.
None of that. No. If it were a solo performance, perhaps, but here I have to delegate things.
Okay, I'll wait until tonight.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Bernie and then loop back to the Latino player experience. What I find so I love Bernie Williams, and what I find so fascinating is that, ironically, he is the type of Latino player that most people aspire for Latinos to be. He was quiet, he was reserved, he was very good. Everybody talks about how hard he worked, and yet he didn't get elevated to this level. I think it's because he's a Black Puerto Rican that people really didn't know what to do with him and how to approach him. Bernie's just a very good guy. Goes back to Dusty Baker and his opportunity. For me, what's fascinating is how the way that MLB operates, good guys like Dusty have a hard time getting what other guys who are not such good guys, who happen to be white, do get. And that continues to be part of the problem of MLB connecting. And Tova, thank you for asking me that question when I commented about how MLB kind of missed out on this generation of fans, partly because I think MLB's approach to social media has been so focused on revenue production instead of fan production. When MLB's production said, you got to take down your quick video of what's going on in the field, and we got to put our 15-second commercial in front of it before it goes up. NBA was like, let it ride. And people turned to this fan engaging way. And NBA's engagement with the 20 and under crowd in the 2020 teens just climbed because it was a fan-friendly approach. And baseball, MLB's approach, has not been fan-friendly. It hasn't been about advancing or promoting the players, but their old generic vanilla type of narrative of America's game, and not updating what is America's game and how it could be the 21st century game of who we are as Americans.
Right.
And I think that has continued to be a challenge. And I think this panel today and a lot of what you all brought up reaffirms that struggle that the leadership of MLB has in dealing with the 21st century reality of what the game is, what it could be, and not meeting those two things.
I loved Bernie, and I hadn't really thought about this because I wrote about and was around the Yankees a lot in that period, and for virtually a good deal of his career. He came up before I was still in college, but for pretty much all of Derek Jeter's career. And if I wrote something negative about Jeter's real flaws, then I had to deal, this was mostly pre-Twitter and stuff, but I got a lot of hostility. But if you pointed out Bernie's flaws, well, everyone pointed out Bernie's flaws. And they were more visible in some ways, as good as he was, in that he didn't throw well, or he was really fast, but he wasn't a great base runner or a great outfielder. He did so many other things well and was so good. And like you said, was just this really mellow guy. And I had the good fortune one time to wander into the clubhouse while he was playing his guitar pregame. It was just an awesome privilege that I had to see that. It's interesting to me now in retrospect that if I said something negative about Jeter, which I did constantly, that people would get on me, but they never got on me for saying something negative about Bernie. And the other thing is, I really don't think people appreciate, for given Bernie's personality, that he was harassed in the clubhouse as a young player by a child molester, Mel Hall, who was also bringing in leopards and things. I mean, just this bizarre situation that they enabled this guy to hassle Bernie Williams and try to destroy him, and they left them together for like 3 years. It's really appalling what effect that had on him.
I think it's pretty funny that we're now heading into an entire conversation about Bernie Williams, which is exactly how we randomly started off the conversation a few weeks ago about doing this webinar. That's extremely odd.
I've always been a big Bernie Williams fan, so it's.
Hey, I love him too.
But I think it is. I mean, there's a couple things that are striking. One is I played softball with a guy years ago. This was like right when Bernie was starting, and he was a really. I was not a great player. He was a good player, and he said that he had gone to some camp in Connecticut for like guys who were all going to go play in college, et cetera, et cetera. And he said we were all the best player on our high school, and there was this quiet Puerto Rican dude who didn't say much. At one time, he took some swings in the batting cage, and we were like, oh, this is what a baseball player is, because he was. I mean, they were all good. He was on another level. But what's also striking about Bernie always to me was that the guy batted cleanup on the New York Yankees, played center field, and they won the World Series every year. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they were very good when he was here. And he was a natural precisely because of who he was. And it was always kind of written as off as, oh, Bernie's shy or something like that, but that was never really plausible. I mean, this is a marketing opportunity. I mean, Adrian, you talked about how Major League Baseball doesn't try to build a fan base that looks like America, or I'm paraphrasing, but Major League Baseball had a head start on the other sports. Baseball began to look like the 21st century America a generation before other sports did, and it kind of squandered that. I mean, it's trying to now, I guess, a little bit, and it still is, I mean, it still is. I mean, someone talked about the Dodgers and Latino fans, but like when I don't go to Dodger games for obvious reasons, but I do go to Giants games. And, to me, the great thing about the Dodger-Giants rivalry is that it's now moved across the country and is largely conducted in Spanish. And I think that's cool, but I think there's not enough of that.
Can I just cut you off for 1 second?
Yeah,
Sorry
please.
to do this, but Frank has to go. I think he has children or something weird like that. So we are starting to lose. I wanted to make sure if you had any last comments you wanted to make, otherwise to say thank you so much for your brilliance and your insight. It's been great.
I certainly don't want to cut off the conversation, but sadly I have to go. Hopefully we'll talk in some other way at some other time. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you, Frank.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much. I unfortunately do have to shuffle off here in a second as well. Sorry to bring everybody down with the earlier comments, but hey, we live in dark times, so at least we could get off of that and then start talking about things like Bernie Williams and Ricky Henderson. That's always a good thing.
That's what we miss.
If we talk more about the Braves, would you stay?
No, actually, I'd probably talk less if we talked about the Braves, because they focus and channel my anger at the current, Major League Baseball business and social world. So,
all right. Well, so Craig, you have any last words besides your apologies for being so dark?
Just want to thank everybody for coming on here. We're gonna have baseball this year, I think, despite my misgivings, and even with those misgivings, there's going to be a Wednesday night when a game is on. And if you guys are like me, you might have social media open up on the side and you have a game on TV or on the radio, and you're going to get lost in that moment. And you're going to think about the 2-2 pitch, and you're going to think about the runner on second, and you're going to think about whether or not the guy in the bullpen is warmed up enough to come in yet. And you're going to get excited. And for 5 minutes, you're going to suspend disbelief, and you're going to forget about all the shit that's going on in this world. And that's what I miss. I think that's what we all miss. But we'll get it, even a little bit, even if it's just for a moment.
Absolutely. Well, we'll see. Thanks, Craig, and thanks for the work that you do reporting every day. Steve, you got any last comments you want to make or insights?
No, like Craig said, I want to thank everybody who certainly has remained to the end, but everybody who came out. It really is wonderful. Particularly, I've seen a lot of people who I've seen interacting with my work in other ways, and it's great to be able to put a face to them. And I hope we get to do this again and do it in a more upbeat way, whether it's about baseball or something else. There's a lot of expertise on a lot of other topics in this room right now, so we'll find the silver lining somewhere. So thank you once again.
I'm going to leave it to you to wrap it up.
Well, first of all, thank you for everybody. We had about 70 people, most of whom stayed till at least, well past 8. So I really appreciate it. And it's a fun opportunity to talk baseball. I do apologize. I mean, I think it is very common when middle-aged baseball fans get together to be negative. And that's something we should maybe not live in too much because it's not healthy. But there's a lot to worry about. And I think I hope Craig is right. You know, I mean, I hope that when baseball does come back, I can get lost in that 2-2 pitch. But I also think that we, you know, I wrote a book called Will Big League Baseball Survive? And I wrote it in 2016. And as part of my research for that book, I tried to trace like the earliest baseball is boring kind of theme. I got as far back as 1909 in a story by Mark Twain or an essay by Mark Twain. And then I kind of lost interest. So to some extent I couldn't follow it. But these ideas have been around kind of for a long time. The shape is changing. I'm talking about the ideas of baseball losing touch, not the bigger societal ideas. But my sense is that baseball occurs in the context, and America is in a different context now than ever, and navigating that context will be different, and it will survive, but it may look different on the other end. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tova, for doing such a great job moderating.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to be with you all. And, you know, maybe we can do this again as things unfold. So thanks everyone for participating, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Thanks, everybody.